of life was he. Yet my Lord was despised and rejected of men, this Jesus of Calvary. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Surely he bore our sorrows, and by his stripes we are healed. Price for healing was paid, as those cruel stripes were made within Pilate's judgment hall. Now his suffering affords perfect healing for all, this wonderful healer's mine. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Surely he bore our sorrows, and by his stripes we are healed. He has healed my sick soul, made me every whit whole, and he'll do the same for you. He's the same yesterday and today and for aye, this healer of men today. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Surely he bore our sorrows, and by his stripes we are healed.
When it comes to names that are considered epic among church movements and especially the holiness movement, the name John Wesley stands out almost like a mountain peak among many, many names. A turning point for the holiness people really reaches back to the experience of one John and his brother Charles Wesley. While there were others that were involved, and there were certainly many that took up the mantle, these two names, and especially John Wesley, sparked what has been called the Wesleyan Revival. The Wesleyan Revival was a period of church history by which special attention was paid to the call of God, that men and women would become holy in life, in character, in behavior, and that they would pursue an absolute knowledge that they were right with God. The backdrop of John Wesley's life is a key to understanding his impact on history. The era leading up to John Wesley and what came to be Methodism, which is the forerunner of current day Methodist churches. What led up to this was, of course, you had centuries of Catholic rule, where the churches pretty much were existent under one major denomination, though you did have small groups. The fact of the matter is, it was not until this era and period when you began to see the rise of many different churches and denominations. Centuries of Catholic rule was interrupted by the Reformation. You had men like Luther and Zwingli and men that we've already spoken of that rose up, and they were weary of the corruption and they were weary of the darkness. And so they began their quest seeking for reality in religion. They believed in the priesthood of the believer. Man did not need to go to someone else in order to touch God, but man could simply go to God on his own and find peace in his heart. He could be saved in spite of what the church may threaten. He did not need the ordinances and rituals of the church in order to be saved. This Reformation was birthed and brought about a tremendous change. But as we have seen, the battle in the Reformation boiled down to theology. When the Reformers stepped out, the Catholics persecuted the Reformers. Many of them were killed. Many of them burned at the stake. But all that did is further the Reformation, and it spread all across Europe. The old Catholic grounds now began to have an uprising of men and women that wanted reality, that were sick of being extorted under the name of religion. The Catholics turned on them, burned them at the stake. Many of them gave their lives, but nevertheless, the Reformation marched on. However, as the Reformation took hold and they began to gain the upper hand, then there arose another dissension. It centered around Oxford, and it centered around John Calvin, who became the namesake of what today is called Calvinism. And Calvinists, in turn, became the persecutors of what came to be Arminians. Arminians sprang from the concepts espoused by Jacobus Arminius, a much longer name, but that's the more common name, who took issue with the 5 points. Now, as I've mentioned before, John Calvin never heard the 5 points of Calvinism the way we've broken them down today. John Calvin never saw the script tulip and the words that those represent. However, in later years, they simplified it and basically accepted it the way that it was. And yet the Arminians rose up in opposition to this. And probably no greater one than John Wesley, who came on the scene after early Arminians had begun to espouse their beliefs. They were persecuted even by the government. Now you had the rise out of Catholic churches. You now had the rise of political movements that saw an opportunity, and they began what came to be called state churches. Probably one of the most notable is the English church, or what came to be called the Anglican church. Very much organized on the same order as the Catholic Church, with priests, with a sort of a pope, if you please, headquartered in England. And the Anglican Church, when it jumped the ocean and came to America, eventually came to be called the Episcopalian Church. That's the American form of the English Anglican Church. Of course, when the Anglican Church got its start at first, many came into it, but it was not long until there rose up people that said, wait a minute, the same corruptions that were in the Catholic Church before us are now present in the Anglican Church. And so they began a work called Puritans, where they sought to purify the church of these corruptions. They were inspired by the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists were in a different part of the country. The Puritans became deeply concerned about the low spiritual level of the Anglican priests. They became concerned about the corruption and about the wickedness among the priesthood. They became concerned about the failure of the people to obey, and chief among those was the alarm over the lack of respect for what they called the Sabbath day. That came to America. And so you have in America what is called the Puritans, who came here seeking for religious freedom. The Puritans were first present in England, desiring to purify the church there. However, when they realized that they could not change the church, they decided to change locations. They crossed the ocean. They came to America. However, God was not finished in England. In England, God began to raise up what came to be called dissenters. They were the first come-outers. And John Wesley is a very important part of that next step of history. John Wesley was born in Epworth, England. He was the 15th of 19 children. They had kind of a small family. Actually, of 19 children, only 9 lived. The others died in childbirth or shortly thereafter. John Wesley and his brother, who was born a year or two after him, John Wesley was raised in the home, and his mother was a daughter of a dissenter. He too was a preacher, but he refused to take part of the Anglican Church. He was inspired by the Anabaptists, who took issue with the established church, and Susanna Wesley became one of the most influential mothers in church history. Susanna Wesley was a powerful example on her children. She was very strict. She taught all of her children, and they knew Greek and Latin. She had very strict schedules in their lives. They were to go to bed at a certain hour. They were to rise at a certain hour. They all had particular tasks that they were to do. And one of the marks of Susanna Wesley is that every day she took a time with every child to inquire about their spiritual life. How are you doing spiritually? Are you still serving the Lord? She checked up on their spiritual life and prayed with them, seeking that her children would grow up to be spiritual children. John Wesley's father was also a pastor, and he was a very good preacher. However, he was in an area where there were very many ruffians. The church was attacked. He, of course, was threatened, but he continued on being faithful. A mark in John Wesley's life that later on he would refer to quite often was the fact that when he was 5 years of age, at the age of 5, John Wesley nearly perished when the house caught fire that he was living in. John Wesley, they recounted later that some embers from the fireplace got into the roof. The house caught fire. And John Wesley, as just a little 5-year-old lad, was in an upstairs window. The story goes that some men climbed on each other's shoulders and were able to rescue John Wesley from an upstairs window. In later years, John Wesley said that he called himself, or he often said that he was a brand plucked from the burning. He always believed that God had a purpose for him in life and that he was to fulfill that purpose and that God spared him for that purpose. He later felt that that fire might have been the fire that sparked the Wesleyan revival. Later years, he went to Oxford in 1720 where he was a student. He was a good student, studied hard and was well respected, even doing some lecturing while he was there. After his time at Oxford, which was a very respected college, he went back near his mother and father's place where he pastored for 2 years, but then was coaxed back to Oxford. He was asked to come there and was asked if he would take up teaching, and so John Wesley went back to Oxford where he began teaching, and he became very interested in the subject of holiness. He began reading and studying. He began studying the Scriptures. When he went back to Oxford, his brother Charles had already gone, and Charles is the famed hymnist of the Wesleyan revival movement. Charles Wesley had begun what came to be called the Holy Club. They were hungry for holiness. They were desiring to live a life that was clean and pure. They knew that God required this, but how to achieve it was somehow beyond their understanding. This group met together in the morning for prayer. They generally prayed from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. They read the Psalms. And then on Wednesday and Friday, they fasted and committed themselves, if possible, not to marry. They did social work, going out and visiting the prisons, visiting and helping the poor. And they became so vibrant over their faith and their drive and their zeal that many despised them. They thought they had gone off the deep end. They called them names, and among those terrible names that they called them, they coined the term Methodists because they thought that by their methods they could be made holy. John Wesley became popular for coining the phrase Christian perfection. Now, this is quite a question. What did he mean by Christian perfection? Did he mean such absolute perfection that one could never sin? Or did he mean a state of grace whereby one could keep a person, where God could keep a person? This became the centerpiece around Wesleyan theology, the doctrine of Christian perfection. Mind you, John Wesley, while coining the term and preaching it, admitted that he himself had spiritual questions in his own life, even going so far as to say that many times he wondered if he was even saved himself. The purpose of the Holy Club was the hope and prayer that somehow through discipline, somehow through their efforts, that they could attain and achieve a perfect life. As is often the case, God allowed them to continue their self-help efforts, and it only ended in failure. John Wesley then became interested in the work of Oglethorpe. In these days of John Wesley, there were what were called debtors' prisons. Here's how debtors' prison work. If you owed money, you can be thrown in prison. However, if you owed money, how are you going to pay it back if you're in prison? And so Oglethorpe began a movement in English Parliament to do away with debtors' prisons. His response was, why don't we go to the New World and found a colony and send those for rehabilitation there who are worthy of debtors' prison? Anybody know the name of that colony? The capital is well known. They even name children after it nowadays. Savannah. Savannah, Georgia. Did you know that? Savannah, you're popular and don't even know it. Georgia became a colony and now a state where these debtors would be sent, and Oglethorpe asked John Wesley to go as a chaplain. John Wesley went thinking that he could become a missionary there and work with some of the low in society, and also desired to go out and do missionary work among the natives of that area. He went there and spent several years. However, he didn't do very well in Georgia. On his way over, as you can guess, the journey across the Atlantic in those days could be quite treacherous. The ships weren't large like we're accustomed to. It could take anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months to come across the Atlantic, and no one ever knew exactly where they were. And so they would go across the Atlantic, and on this journey in which John Wesley was journeying, they encountered a tremendous storm. The ship was tossed to and fro, and on board the ship were some that were called Moravians. They had followed the teachings of Zwingli and the Moravians, and John Wesley was somewhat impressed with them and became friends with the leader of that group called August Spangenberg. August Spangenberg was taking a group of Moravians to the New World where he could found a colony where they could have religious freedom. In fact, it was he that founded the city of Nazareth, Pennsylvania. It was there that the Moravians began and started. But while on that ship, John Wesley observed that while he was full of fear and while others were fearful, these were calm and they were praising God. They were singing and glorifying God even in the midst of the storm. He began to inquire about their piety. He began to ask them questions about their beliefs and saw there an interest in holiness. John Wesley made it to Savannah, and while he's there, things didn't go quite the way that he had planned. In fact, he, as an Anglican priest, he, of course, was very sincere and very devout and very strict. He fell out of favor with many of those of that area, and probably his low point, he had met a young lady by the name of Sophie Hopke. He fell in love with her and thought at some point that he would like to marry Sophie. He went along, but finally, after deciding that perhaps that was not the will of God, he decided not to marry her. And Sophie quickly found someone else and was married rather shortly thereafter. What complicated the matters was that John Wesley was her pastor and her new husband's pastor. Because she entered into this marriage so quickly and without very much prayer and thought in his mind, he decided to withhold communion from them as a means of punishment. This did not help matters at all. he finally, after 2 years, leaves defeated from Georgia and heads back home, where he continues in his despair and in his quest, seeking for reality in his spiritual life. John Wesley would often testify that he knew that he was saved, but and yet he knew that there was still a struggle within his heart. And on Pentecost Sunday, May the 21st, 1738, something amazing happened. His brother Charles, some weeks before that, had entered into a spiritual experience that had set him free, he claimed, from the inner struggles of sin. Charles Wesley had entered into spiritual bliss, and he confronts John Wesley and tells him, I know now that I am right with God. I have the witness in my heart. Charles Wesley urged his brother to seek, and that there was something more for them. Well, Charles Wesley had been sanctified holy. And in his journal for that day, Charles Wesley reports experiencing a strange palpitation of heart that caused him to exclaim, I believe, I believe. And several sentences later, he continues, I now found my peace with God and rejoiced in hope of loving Christ. When John visited the next day, Charles shared what had happened for him, and together they prayed for John to enter into a spiritual experience just the same. Charles wrote, I almost believed the Holy Ghost was coming upon him. Later that week, John Wesley writes in his own journal that he very unwittingly went to a society meeting on Aldersgate Street. It was there on Aldersgate Street that they were reading the preface of Martin Luther's work on Romans. While there in seeking God, John Wesley proclaims that his heart was strangely warmed. John Wesley said that he was saved in that experience. However, when later questioned about it, John Wesley clarified the event by making clear that yes, he had been saved before, but he still had the inner struggles of the nature of sin. While seeking the Lord had given him the Scriptures that we might be partakers of the divine nature. It was then that he realized that that experience on Aldersgate Street had delivered him from the inner struggle against the nature of sin. And he said, I reckon myself to be dead indeed unto sin. This was a great change in the life of John Wesley. While being questioned at later times about this, and even about his writings, men would ask him about the contradiction of his writings. John Wesley would often tell them, if you go to my Aldersgate experience date and you read backwards, you will find many questions and doubts in my writings. But from that moment at Aldersgate Street, I entered into a clear experience of knowing where I am with God. The Wesleyan revival that was sparked by this centered on the Scripture. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. John Wesley and Charles, his brother, said that prior to that they lived in doubts, in often doubts. However, at that moment they entered into the assurance, clarity, knowing that they were right with God and that they were sanctified holy. I would like to just pause a moment and tell you that I have talked to people who have read the stories of John Wesley and some that have read his writings, and they have insinuated that John and Charles Wesley said, "Never testify to being sanctified." Let me tell you tonight, that is actually not a very fair analysis, because there is a difference in his early writings and in his later writings. In fact, John Wesley later wrote that a person could not be sanctified unless he confessed to it. John Fletcher said that he lost the experience numerous times because he simply failed to testify to the experience of entire sanctification. This greatly revolutionized John Wesley. John Wesley never intended to found a denomination. However, he went back to his church and began to preach, but was quickly turned out because of his preaching on holiness. John Wesley then turned to his own people. He was very close friends with another young man that was in the meetings at Oxford at the Holy Club, a very familiar name by the name of George Whitefield. George Whitefield invited John Wesley, "Come," because George Whitefield was doing something very strange in those days. He was preaching in open-air meetings. What? He invited John Wesley to join him, and join him he did. And he went out and began to preach in the open-air meetings to the minors and to sinners. And a tremendous revival began to break out wherever they preached. This, friends, became the spark of the Wesleyan revival, and the same revival that jumped the ocean and came to be called in America the Great Awakening. That Great Awakening centered around clear preaching on living right and holiness, and having a clear experience that you are right with God at this moment. I just want to touch on this. John Wesley tried every possible humanistic approach to religious certainty and the pursuit of Christian perfection. John Wesley testified that at last the only door that would open up to him to the realities of Christian assurance and holiness was Christ Himself. Intellectualism, ritualism, legalism, moralism, and mysticism all failed him. But at Aldersgate is where he found true peace. He himself said, "I was taught that peace and victory over sin are essential to faith in the captain of our salvation. And as to the transports of joy that usually attend the beginning of it, especially in those who have mourned deeply, God sometimes giveth and sometimes withholdeth them according to the counsels of His own will." John Wesley struggled for a time because the emotional tide would subside. However, he came to understand, because the very night of this happening, the enemy of his soul suggested to him, "This cannot be faith. Where is thy joy?" Turning to the Lord in earnest prayer, the Lord taught him that victory over sin was entirely different than just joy in the heart. He later came back that night with temptations, but God gave him victory. And Wesley soon learned the difference between his pre- and post-Aldersgate encounters with sin and the tempter. He said, "Prior to Aldersgate, I was often conquered, but now I found that I was always the conqueror." Wesley soon discovered that first he could be in heaviness through manifold temptations, and yet be pleasing to God and have victory over sin. And secondly, he learned that this victory of faith could not be maintained without ceaseless believing prayer. John Wesley witnessed, God had given some degree of faith even to me. I know it by its fruits. I have constant peace, not one uneasy thought. I have freedom from sin. I have not one unholy desire. I'm telling you, friends, this revolutionized the life of John Wesley. John Wesley went out and began preaching holiness everywhere he went. His message carried forth and became the foundation of the holiness revival. In America, Methodism sprang up. In that book, The Light and the Glory, the story is told, and it became the motto of the Methodist movement, on a stretch for God. Those holiness people spread out and fanned across the frontiers of America, going to little homes and little homesteads, preaching the gospel and teaching that they could be free from sin. This, friends, then sprang up the Methodist Church, and out of that many other. In fact, very soon we're going to trace the trail of the various holiness movements that sprang out of this. The Methodist Church for 100 years maintained a fervor in this country that could not be matched. John Wesley, however, prophesied of his own church's demise. He said, if the Methodists ever quit preaching holiness, the church will sink by its own weight. Is it not a wonder that, was it this past weekend, that the Methodist Church met thinking to legalize homosexual marriage and to allow its ministers to be homosexuals? It failed. Guess who caused it to fail? The very heathen from other countries that the people of America went to win. And you should have heard, was it the Bishop of Africa that said it is time that we send missionaries to our church in America? Isn't that amazing? Well, I want to tell you, you are going to see the movement like wildfire of the holiness revival that spread and became the foundation of many churches and movements down through the centuries here in America and in other places. Father in heaven, thank you for our heritage. Now, Lord, again today we were struck with the reality that John Wesley said, we can know that we're right with God. We can know that our heart is pure. Lord, I pray today that there not be one heart here living in doubt. Help us, Lord, to live in the assurance and the reality of your presence. Bless us, Lord. Give us a wonderful week and help us to do your will. In Jesus' name, amen. May the Lord bless you. You're dismissed.